English humour, a swift skim over the surface of English language humour. Part 4, Bawdy and Innuendo.
I was at Butlins once with my parents, so I'd have been about 13, 14, and part of a show that we saw involved the compere picking people at random from the audience and then leading them off stage. And while they were gone, saying that all they were going to do was bring them back on one by one, sit them in the chair, and all we were asked to do was to imagine that what they said was the first thing they said on their wedding night. So the first woman came on and was left sitting in the chair for a while until she looked around the theatre and said, "Isn't it big?" which got a good laugh. And then the second chap came on and he said, "Are we going to wait all night?" or something like that. And, well, this pricked my interest as I went the following night to see what the repeat of this bit of the show would be like. Turned out it was all a trick. They were told what to say. They said, "Go and sit in the chair, wait for a while, and then say this," and people will laugh. But it kind of shows you how easy it is to make people laugh within this framework of the taboo, in this case the sexual, things you mustn't say, things you could hear quite innocently, but then turn into something really quite smutty, as is often done in conversation in English when people might add the tag to something somebody says, as the actress said to the bishop, often completely filthying up the original intention of the speaker. Well, this is a brief history, but it's a history. So let's see how far we can go back to trace what is called bawdy in English. The parts that rely on wordplay are often called double entendre in this sort of faux French that we sometimes use. I don't think French people would understand that. It's like ensuite bathroom. In any case, we'll be looking at some Viking bawdy later on, so let's start with Geoffrey Chaucer, Canterbury Tales, first non-religious thing printed in English. Pilgrims meet and swap tales, often full of ribald, bawdy encounters with sex and bodily functions playing a star part. And around Shakespeare's time, there was a kind of fashion for speaking indirectly, shall we say. We find in a collection of a certain Feargod Barbon, a poem where an Englishman is having sex with a Welsh woman and hears her say dig on. She's trying to say enough, but he understands the English dig on and replies, "Dig on that can," quoth he, "for I so sore have digged already that I can dig no more." In another pamphlet of the same time, we can see, accompanied by the image of a member in hand, imprinted at Pool Bar at the sign of the hand and the star, if you put the S after the R. And if you put the S after the R, you would get TARS, which doesn't mean anything to us these days, but is one of the many, many phonemes that are stood in for the male member. The John Thomas, the cock, the prick. Speaking of prick, that's an old expression and was used for double entendre quite often in its day. Let's go back to Shakespeare. Here's Cloten in Cymbeline. "I am advised to give her music o' mornings. They say it will penetrate." Then some musicians come in, and he continues, "Come on, tune, if you can penetrate her with your fingering. So, we'll try with tongue too. If none will do, let her remain, but I'll never give o'er," which scarcely needs any commentary. Certainly Thomas Bowdler, born in 1754, thought that kind of thing might be better covered up, and so he did. He published what we now call Bowdlerized edition of Shakespeare, where the naughty bits have been cut out. And poor old Thomas has this fame of being a strict censor, but of course in those days cutting those bits out would have enabled more people to read Shakespeare that maybe otherwise wouldn't have. So there are some examples of bawdy through the ages. Let's leap now to London Music Hall. mentioned before as the starting point of vaudeville in America. But imagine being the poor comedian up there with the audience all standing up and possibly chattering. Three sides of the standing space was a bar in many cases, so they'd be quite ruddy-faced by the time you got on. So you had to get their attention pretty quick, and suggestive wordplay was often a part of the armoury. The idea of speaking in a kind of secret language, which is the origin and impulse of slang, where you can talk about money, prostitution, other types of crime, supposedly in a way that the police and the upper classes won't understand. Well, then you got the development of this kind of way of speaking about things that weren't supposed to be spoken about in a secret language. And this happened especially in the late 50s, 60s. I remember in my childhood watching on the television comedians who were so camp that these days it's impossible not to see that they were camp. But homosexuality was still so hidden in those days. In fact, it wasn't legalised until 1964, even in Great Britain, with the arched eyebrows and the suggestive looks and the constant double entendres that maybe went over a lot of people's heads. Kenneth Williams, I'm thinking of, Larry Grayson, John Inman, they were all able to get away with murder, basically. There was, in fact, a secret language spoken amongst homosexuals, but also in London fish markets, the theatre fairgrounds, circuses, a lot of Italian. It was known as polare, from parlare, to speak, but very much associated with the gay subculture. Hardly any words come down to modern English from polare, except possibly naff, meaning inferior or tacky. As the BBC transformed from the starchy 1950s, we can't swear, we can't even do suggestive jokes, this is public broadcasting service, moving forward into the 80s, 90s, people, according to Angus Dayton interview on Radio 4 in 2014, they began to play a kind of game to see if they could, in fact, shove some double entendres into the radio shows. There were some throat pastilles called quillies, for example, and the instruction to suck quillies, if said a little bit faster, might just pass through. And of course there were sections called Mass Debate. The incredible comic Ken Dodd, who died aged 100,000 recently, and still was gigging doing shows of up to 5 hours, usually signed off with a song called Happiness, in which he would tell us all that happiness, happiness is the greatest thing that I possess. I thank the Lord that I've been blessed with more than my share of happiness. Happiness is what he said, or was it? We'll never know. Sadly debunked is the myth that Captain Pugwash, which was a children's cartoon series of the 60s, Captain Pugwash was a pirate, and this was slang for what is now known as a bukkake, is apparently unfounded, and it's such a shame because there was a mass debate on the crew, as well as a sailor known as Staines, therefore we could get seaman stains. This kind of thing amuses the British so much that a whole film industry was built up on it. They're known as the Carry On films, as the first one was Carry On Sergeant. They're just basically very thin storylines strung together with innuendo, and my father hated them. Really quite terrible jokes, but they were successful. They even got their homage at the South Bank in the 90s as part of British art. Here is a taster from Carry On Cleo. I am undone, my end is in sight, which sounds innocent enough until you think maybe it is a double entendre. This is the same film that includes infamy, infamy, they've all got it infamy, let's not forget. Can't remember which Carry On film it is now, but I think Sid James it is getting into a taxi. The driver asks, Hampton Court? Passenger says, no, I always walk like this. So let's untangle this one. Hampton is another name for the male member. This time it's Cockney rhyming slang. Hampton Wick is the derivation. Court, Hampton Court, we know that there's a palace, but has your dick been caught? No, I always wore like that. Anyway, that kind of joke. That kind of joke. By the way, Talbot Rothwell wrote that last little gem. Perhaps more famous for the best line in Dr. Strangelove, which is, of course, gentlemen, gentlemen, you can't fight here. This is the war room. And like it or not, the innuendo will keep rearing its head. Michael Myers' character, Austin Powers, uses enough of them, and I am sure they will have a long life in years to come. I can't leave a section on Bawdy without mentioning Donald McGill. The trouble here is that he was an entirely visual artist. When I say entirely visual, he drew the saucy seaside postcards with the standard characters of the huge wife and the scrawny henpecked husband, the alcoholic with the glowing red nose, and the girls in their bathing suits. McGill was born in 1875, died in 1962, so you can imagine the era. We're probably in the 40s, the 50s. But the captions are innuendos and double entendre galore. There were more of these postcard artists, but Mr. McGill married the daughter of Crowder's, one of the most famous music halls, and that didn't do him any harm. He was able to charge £3 and 3 shillings per picture at the height of his fame. And these you can now buy, if you've got one, for thousands of pounds, because most of them were destroyed by court order in 1954, as he was brought up on charges of obscenity in Lincoln and found guilty under the Obscene Publications Act of 1857. So he had to pay his £75 and watch how a lot of his postcards got destroyed. He didn't really do anymore because nobody else was going to sell them. So that was the end of the saucy postcard industry, as this is the end of English humour number 4, where we've had a quick look at dick jokes, basically.